After she died, they kept selling tickets. And they did it for more than 100 years. Not weeks, not months. The woman was gone. The sales pitch got louder. Her name was Julia Pastrana. The billing varied depending on the city and the decade. The Bear Woman, the nondescript, the Ape Woman, sometimes just the ugliest woman in the world. The words on the handbill changed, but the transaction stayed the same. Pay the admission, walk past the curtain, look at the body. The body, that is the anomaly. That is the case file. A multilingual singer and dancer dies in 1860. Her husband has her body preserved and keeps it touring. Long after the manager who bought her is dead, long after the fairgrounds that housed her are demolished, long after anyone alive at her death can possibly remember her voice. The exhibit just keeps moving. New owners, new countries, new centuries, until she ends up in a storage facility in Norway, cataloged, shelved, waiting. The case opens with a question any detective would ask. Who was she before the pitch? Before the curtain? Before the first ticket was ever sold? She was born in 1834. The location is not exact, but the consensus points to the Sierra Madre region of Mexico, likely in what is now Sinaloa. She was an indigenous woman. And she was born with two conditions that would define every interaction she ever had with the outside world. The first was generalized hypertrichosis. Her body produced excessive hair. Her face, her arms, her torso, covered in dark hair, congenital, meaning present from birth. The second condition was gingival hyperplasia. Her gums thickened, overgrown, pushing her jaw forward, giving her mouth and lower face a pronounced protruding shape. Two separate genetic realities. Neither one made her sick. Neither one affected her mind. Neither one affected her from walking, speaking, singing, or dancing. But together in the 1830s, they made her a commodity. The exact mechanics of the transaction are hazy in the record. What is certain is that by the time she was a child, she had been acquired by someone who saw her body not as a body but as an asset. She was purchased or obtained by a man named Espinosa, who exhibited her locally, and then she was transferred, sold, or traded to showmen who took her north. By the early 1850s, she was being exhibited in the United States. A young indigenous Mexican girl taken from her homeland, put on a stage, and presented as a freak of nature. The early handbills are physical evidence. They survive. They use words like singular and extraordinary and nondescript. The nondescript. That was a specific term from the era, borrowed from natural history classification, used to describe something that could not be categorized, something between species. The implication was clear, not quite human. Something to be studied, something to be stared at. But here's where the case takes its first turn, because Julia Pastrana was not a silent object on that stage. She was a performer. Look closer at the historical record, and the woman behind the hair and the gums begins to emerge. She sang, she danced, she spoke multiple languages, Spanish, her native tongue, English, which she learned and performed in, and reportedly at least some French. A multilingual vocalist who could command a crowd not just by standing there, but by doing something, by performing a skill. The contemporary research bears this out. Scholars who have reconstructed her career. Rosemary Garland Thompson, a leading voice in disability studies, and Anne Marquez Grant, a forensic anthropologist who studied her physical remains. Both describe a woman who was not passive. She was a professional entertainer. She was compensated. She toured. She performed across the United States and Europe. The audience came for the spectacle of the freak. What they got was someone who could sing in their own language and dance better than most of them could. That gap is everything. The gap between what the handbill said she was and what the evidence shows she was. The handbill said curiosity. The evidence says artist. The handbill said specimen. The evidence says woman with a repertoire. And the most jarring detail of all is this: she married her manager. In the late 1850s, Julia Pastrana married a man named Theodore Lent. He was the one booking the halls, negotiating the fees, printing the handbills that called his wife the Bear Woman. And on paper, marriage might look like stability. It might look like partnership. It might look like the one person in her life who saw her as human enough to marry. The record suggests otherwise. The scholarly consensus, supported by the documented control Lent exerted over her earnings and her touring schedule, is that the marriage was a business consolidation. He married his asset. He gained legal control over her money, her movements, and her body. In the 19th century, a wife was property in the eyes of the law, and Theodore Lent knew exactly what that meant for his bottom line. He wasn't her protector. He was her lock. The structure was now complete. She lived on the road. She performed. She generated revenue. And the man who collected that revenue was also the man who shared her bed and signed her contracts. If she ever wanted out, there was no out. The law gave her husband the final word. Her voice, which filled theaters with song, had no legal weight. And then she became pregnant. In 1860, the tour reached Moscow. Julia was likely exhausted. She had been performing for years with almost no documented break. She went into labor. She gave birth to a son. The infant had hypertrichosis. The same thick hair that covered his mother covered him. He lived only hours. What happened to his body? A child born into the same body that made his mother a fortune, and he did not survive the day. Julia did not recover. The birth had been complicated. Infection, likely sepsis, set in. A few days after her son died, Julia Pastrana died too. The date was March of 1860. She was 26 years old, possibly 27. The exact age is one of the details the record never locked down with certainty. A young woman, a mother, a multilingual performer dead in Moscow, thousands of miles from the Sierra Madre. And this is where the ordinary tragedy ends, and the crime. The moral crime, the crime of the century. Theodore Lent did not bury his wife. He did not bury his son. He saw an opportunity that no one, under any ethical standard, would see as an opportunity. He sold or leased both bodies to a Moscow anatomical institute. There, in the laboratory, the bodies of Julia and her infant son were preserved, mummified, treated with chemicals and techniques designed to halt decomposition, to turn flesh into something stable, something permanent, something that could be kept. The institute did the work. Lent then retrieved them. He took the mummified bodies of his wife and his newborn son, and he put them back on tour. Consider this: Amen takes the preserved corpse of the woman he married, the preserved corpse of the child she died giving birth to, and he charges admission again. The same ticket booth, the same handbills, the same barker's voice shouting the same pitch with one key update: come see. The Bear Woman, she's dead now. She is dead, and she is right here behind this curtain, standing in a glass case. The pitch that sold tickets for a living performer now sold tickets for a corpse. The voice was the same voice. The man was the same man. Only the performer was silent, and the tour expanded. Lent took the mummified bodies across Europe. City after city, country after country. The woman who once sang and danced was now a permanent exhibit, frozen, unmoving. Her son somewhere nearby, also frozen, also on display. It is almost impossible, from a modern vantage point, to reconcile the images we have of Julia Pastrana in life, the formal portraits, the performance attire, the upright posture of a professional, with what she became, the mummified body standing in a case, still wearing a dress. still, in some awful sense of the word, costumed. The exhibition ran for years. Lent was nothing if not a businessman. He charged admission. He printed new advertisements. He even remarried. He found a new wife, a woman who did not share Julia's conditions, and he integrated her into the show. The living wife and the dead wife on tour together. The dead wife drew the crowds. The living wife stood beside the case and pointed. The sales pitch had become a family business. Julia Pastrana's body was now the most reliable earner Theodore Lent had ever managed. In life, she could get sick. She could get tired. She could, in theory, protest. In death, she never missed a show. She never demanded a cut of the gate. She never aged. She just stood there, hair still thick, jaw still pronounced, face still recognizable, a permanent asset on a permanent lease from mortality itself. The case at this point asks a structural question. How long does something like this last? A few years? A decade? Until the public forgets? Until the owner dies? No. The owner would die. Theodore Lent eventually exited the story, but the body did not. The exhibit was sold, then sold again, then passed to a fair, then to a museum, then to a private collector. The body of Julia Pastrana kept moving, kept being displayed, kept generating gate receipts for someone into the 20th century. The 1900s arrived. The Great War, the Depression, another world war. And still her remains were somewhere in the circuit, still part of some collection, still being looked at by paying customers who had no idea they were staring at a woman who sang in 3 languages. She was gone. But the body was not, and the real tour was only beginning. The real tour had no end date written into the contract. Theodore Lent eventually lost control of the exhibit, the way all middlemen lose control of a thing that outlives them. He died in the early 1900s, but the body didn't. It was sold, then sold again, then traded to a fair, then to a museum, then to a private collector whose name didn't appear in any program. The chain of custody became a chain of gate receipts. For decades, no one saw a woman. They saw an item on an inventory list. And every time the item changed hands, the sales pitch got a little quieter, a little more clinical, a little more official. But the admission price never dropped to zero. By the 1920s, Julia Pastrana's mummified body was part of a Norwegian fair circuit. It stood in a case in Oslo, among other attractions, still wearing the remnants of a dress, still drawing eyes. The people who stopped to look had no context. They didn't know about the singing. They didn't know about the languages. They didn't know about the childbirth in Moscow. They just saw the hair, the jaw, the label. The label said something different depending on the year. The bare woman in one decade, the nondescript in another. A medical specimen in a third. The name Julia Pastrana faded from the placard. Her body had outlasted her identity. Then the world moved on, the fairs closed, the museums reorganized. Somewhere in the shuffle, the body went into storage. A warehouse in Norway, a crate, a shelf. For years, nobody even knew it was there. The woman who had packed houses in London and Vienna and Moscow was now an unmarked object in a facility that didn't specialize in circus history. It specialized in institutional forgetfulness. The body sat there through the Great Depression, through the Second World War, through the post-war rebuild, through the decades when the very idea of human display became a source of public discomfort. But nobody came looking for her. Nobody asked if she should still be there. The rediscovery happened slowly. In the 1970s, researchers at the University of Oslo began cataloging human remains held in various Norwegian collections. Among them was a body with pronounced facial features and extensive hair growth. The records were thin. The name on the file was inconsistent. Some reports said the body came from a circus. Others said it was an anatomical specimen of unknown origin. The university's Institute of Basic Medical Sciences took custody. The body was placed in a storage room alongside other remains, awaiting study, awaiting a purpose, awaiting anything. It's here that the second body enters the question. You'll recall that Julia Pastrana gave birth to a son in Moscow, and that infant also died, and his body was also mummified. For decades, mother and son toured together. 2 cases, 2 sets of remains, 2 admission fees. But by the time the university inventory was complete, the son was gone. The records don't agree on when or how. Some say his body was destroyed in the 1930s. Others say it was discarded during a museum deaccession. Others say it simply vanished from a storage facility and no one filed a report. The Norwegian committee that later investigated could find no trace of the infant. Julia remained. Her son did not. The erasure was total. Not even a grave. That absence changed the conversation. When researchers and ethicists began examining the case in the 1990s, they weren't just looking at one body in a basement. They were looking at a double exhibition that had been reduced to a single specimen, and the missing half of the set made the ethical questions impossible to ignore. Who owned this body? Who had ever owned it? What was the difference between a medical specimen and a circus exhibit? And what did the University of Oslo owe to a woman who had never consented to be in any collection anywhere? The answers didn't come from within the institution. They came from an artist. Laura Anderson Barbata, a Mexican-born artist and researcher, began working on Julia Pastrana's story in the early 2000s. She didn't approach it as a historical footnote. She approached it as an open case. She gathered documentation, tracked down the chain of custody, placed the body's journey on a map, and then did something the exhibitors never did. She asked what Julia would have wanted. The question itself was a radical act, because for more than 100 years, nobody had posed it. Barbata assembled a coalition: scholars, diplomats, human rights advocates, forensic experts. Her argument was simple in its moral logic. Julia Pastrana was an indigenous Mexican woman who was exhibited without consent during her life, mutilated into a commodity after her death, and retained by institutions that had no legitimate claim to her body. The only appropriate response was repatriation, burial in her homeland. Dignity, however belated. The campaign moved from art spaces to government offices. The Mexican government backed the request. The University of Oslo was faced with a question it had never formally considered: whether a body acquired through 19th century circus channels could meet modern ethical standards for retention. The answer was no. In 2012, the Norwegian National Committee for the Evaluation of Research on Human Remains issued its recommendation. The wording was clinical, but the conclusion was clear. Julia Pastrana's remains were not legitimately held. They had been obtained through a history of exploitation. They should be returned to Mexico for burial. The committee cited ethical principles, human dignity, and the complete absence of consent. It was, in its own quiet, bureaucratic language, a verdict. The university accepted the recommendation. The paperwork moved. The body was prepared for transport. In February of 2013, 153 years after she died in a Moscow apartment, Julia Pastrana's remains were flown to Mexico. The last ticket was a one-way. No admission was charged. The burial took place in Sinaloa, the region where she was born. A Catholic ceremony, a coffin draped in white, flowers, music, prayers in Spanish. The women of the community led the procession. They had researched her story. They called her by her name. The sales pitch was absent. No barker stood at the gate. No placard reduced her to a condition. No glass separated her from the people who had come. She was laid in the earth, in her own country, among her own people, and the century-long tour finally ended. The woman who had been sold as a freak, displayed as a specimen, stored as an item, was buried as a person. The gap between those two facts is the entire story, what does the case leave us? Not a neat resolution, not a simple villain to blame. The exploitation of Julia Pastrana wasn't the work of one bad man. It was the work of a system that rewarded the display of human difference. Theodore Lent was the most visible operator, but after him came a string of fair managers, museum curators, private collectors, and institutional administrators who all made the same choice: keep the exhibit open. The body generated value. Value justified possession. Possession silenced questions, until it didn't. The glass case is empty now. The pitch is silent. But the case file on Julia Pastrana changes how we see every human remain still on display. You walk through a museum, you see a skeleton mounted for study, you see a mummy behind glass, you see a collection of bones tagged with accession numbers. You assume consent, you assume dignity. You assume the person in the case wanted to be there, or at least didn't mind, or at least is beyond caring. Julia Pastrana's story tells you to stop assuming. Her body was never donated. It was taken. It was sold. It was transferred. It was infertile. It was studied. It was displayed. And for every step in that chain, there was someone who could have said, "This is wrong. This is a woman. This is not ours to keep." Almost no one said it, not for more than a century. The burial in Sinaloa wasn't just an end. It was an acknowledgement, an admission that the entire framework was built on a mistake no one wanted to correct. The mistake was treating a human being as a thing that could be owned. And once you treat a person as property, the logic of the market takes over. You sell, you buy, you store, you catalog, you store, you catalog, you forget. But the body remembers, the body stays in the record. It sits in the basement until someone asks the right question. Julia Pastrana was asked no questions her whole life. She was labeled, priced, and billed. She sang and they called it a novelty. She danced and they called it a spectacle. She died and they called it an opportunity. The only time she was given a choice was when her voice was gone. The repatriation didn't undo any of that. It couldn't. But it did something else. It rewrote the final line of the file. The file no longer ends with specimens stored in Oslo. It ends with buried in Sinaloa. That change in language is the entire difference between a thing and a person. The next time you see human remains in an exhibition, ask the question Julia Pastrana's exhibitors never wanted asked. Who said yes to this? Did this person consent to be here, or did someone just never say no? The answer, more often than you'd like, is the second one. And the woman in the case, the one they called the bear woman, the one they called the nondescript, the one whose name was Julia, she's the reason you now know to ask.